All right, so we're looking at the beginning of this chiropractic profession, which, as we said last week, was an offshoot of the osteopathic profession. And there's some evidence that this guy, who is D.D. Palmer, or Daniel David Palmer, may have received some training from Andrew Still. So Daniel David Palmer was kind of an interesting character. Unlike Andrew Still, he had no formal medical education. Recall, Andrew Still was a medical doctor first. So D.D. Palmer was a self-educated healer. He came from Iowa, if I remember correctly, I believe, Davenport, Iowa. And he founded the chiropractic profession in 1895. And he founded this profession basically on two premises. One was that spinal misalignment, so when the spinal cord is out of sync, out of alignment, that causes abnormal nerve transmission, which we just mentioned, and that's the primary cause of virtually every disease. Two, that chiropractic adjustment, which is basically manual manipulation of the spine, the subluxed vertebra. Subluxation is when a vertebra is kind of like out of alignment. That chiropractic adjustment is the cure to virtually every disease. So the chiropractic profession was kind of founded on this like one cause, one cure kind of a philosophy. And that has been the guiding principle of the chiropractic profession for a while. I think modern day chiropractors would potentially disagree with this, or maybe they would expand the one cause, one cure kind of philosophy. But historically, this was the founding principle. And so hence, the treatment of spinal subluxation is the key to the chiropractic profession. A lot of chiropractors do a lot more, but this is something that they all do. They all adjust. Their technique might be different, and we'll kind of talk about some of that. But that's a unifying principle. And it came from this guy, Daniel David Palmer. So he was a faith healer. And he was known to be kind of a charismatic fellow. And he was kind of a laying on of hands sort of a guy. And he was also manipulating the spine. And I'm sure the manipulations that he learned were from the osteopaths, notable Andrew Still. There's sort of an interesting story about this guy, Daniel David Palmer. And it centers around a patient who was a janitor, a deaf janitor by the name of Harvey Lillard. And he worked in the building where Palmer had an office. And he came in for a therapy, a treatment. So he's deaf, right? I think I mentioned that. So he comes in to be treated by D.D. Palmer, and D.D. Palmer noticed that he had a pretty pronounced spinal misalignment in his upper back. So he adjusted him. Daniel David Palmer adjusted him. And consequently, the deaf janitor was able to hear for the first time in like 20 years or so. So, that was kind of a cool thing. And Palmer is now thinking that he's discovered a cure for deafness, which then brought all kinds of other deaf people to see him. And that didn't always work. But this, I can't really tell you why exactly the treatment worked, but probably there was he wasn't actually deaf, we're talking about in the 1800s, right? It's harder to know what's going on, but I'm guessing that there was a subluxation that was interfering with one of the spinal nerves that supply the ear, right? So the ear is that your ability to hear is due to the ear is incredibly complex, but it's a sensory organ, and it's you need to have receptors stimulated. So sound waves basically travel through the air, and they ultimately work their way into where we have receptors for sound, which is in the inner ear. And then when those receptors are hit, these are basically specialized nerve cells. They then trip a nerve, which then sends a message to your brain, which happens to be in the temporal lobe of your brain where the auditory cortex is. And then your brain is able to decode this message, and you respond accordingly. So I'm guessing what happened is his subluxation was interfering with that nerve's function, right? And by adjusting him, that allowed for the transmission of those pathways to go more smoothly, and he was able to hear, right? So, going through the physiology of the inner ear is something that we can't do in 5 minutes, but that, I'm guessing, was what happened in this success, right? If he was truly deaf, meaning that it wasn't interference of a nerve, then that would not have resolved. And I'm sure that all the other deaf people that came to see D.D. Palmer, I'm sure he didn't have that kind of success. He just got super lucky right out of the gate, I think is a good way to think about it, right? So anyway, that's an interesting story. And it helped to get him really on his road to some success. All right, so Palmer, going back to Palmer, he kind of pioneered this theory of this joint-oriented nerve interference, which is kind of what we've been talking about. So he was sort of an interesting character. And he really kind of, even without medical training, was really looking into this and looking for an understanding between the spine and its relationship to health. And he decided and realized that his treatments were basically restoring nerve function by relieving these misalignments in the spine. And these misalignments in the spine, again, are known as subluxations. Your vertebra, right, your spinal column, your spinal cord is protected by these bones that are called vertebrae. And you've got some at the top of which I'm sure many of you know, you've got your cervical vertebrae at the top, your thoracic and kind of your thoracic portion of your body, and then your lumbar vertebrae and your lower back and your sacrum, and your spinal cord runs through the middle of those, right? There's a big blocky part in the front, and then these kind of like offshoots, and the bones, the vertebrae are built to protect the spinal cord. And then from between each one of these bones that sort of stack like blocks, the spinal nerves come out, the peripheral nerves come out of the sides, and they run through this sort of, complicated sort of puzzle piece. And if the vertebrae is subluxed, right, if it's twisted or turned, then that can put pressure on the nerves, right? And so it's very sensible, right? And it makes sense. And so Palmer's idea here was that by correcting these vertebral subluxations or these misalignments, then that enabled the body's own, what he referred to as innate intelligence, which is just basically back to our holistic theory, right? The healing power of nature, the body has the ability to heal itself. So that's kind of what he was talking about with this innate intelligence. All right, so he went on to form the first chiropractic college in 1897. And then then we saw in 1913 the first state licensing law, and he then sort of cemented this philosophy, which was essentially a means of connecting the spiritual man to the physical man. So now we're bringing in, and remember, this is what the osteopaths kind of left out. There wasn't any talk of the spiritual stuff with Andrew Still, right? He did believe in the body's ability to heal itself, but he didn't spend a lot of time talking about the spiritual man versus the physical man, right? But D.D. Palmer did. So he really started to bring in this, which is ultimately going to be built into our holistic theory and practice, which is, the mind, body, and the spirit. So that was addressed here in the chiropractic profession. And again, when you connect the spiritual man to the physical man, you eliminate the interference to the flow of the innate intelligence, which I think is kind of interesting, right? All right, so that's D.D. Palmer. Okay, so after D.D. Palmer, he died, and I'm looking in my notes to see if I have when he died. I don't, for some reason, I didn't write it down. I apologize for that. But after D.D. Palmer, we see the entry of his son, Bartlett Joshua Palmer. So Bartlett Joshua Palmer, now he really picked up the ball, right? So his dad kind of laid it out, and B.J. Palmer really picked it up and ran with it, if you will. And this guy was really a character, incredibly charismatic from reports, incredibly charismatic, and really in for the fight here, right? He really he's been credited with really molding the profession into what it ultimately is today, right? He really gets a lot of credit for that. And I think it's because he was very outspoken, and he was very pro-chiropractic and kind of in your face about it. So, he was pretty successful. So he had a radio show, which the radio show was called WOC Radio, or The Wonders of Chiropractic Radio. And in his radio show, he really, to his credit, he really touted chiropractic, but to his detriment, potentially, he really bagged on any other kind of, at that time, the American medical, the allopaths, right? The American Medical Association, which they weren't into. That made for kind of a very combative, this was a rocky road with B.J. Palmer. But his core philosophy wasn't all that different, right? He was just a little bit more in your face about it. So again, he held that any disease in the body is affected at least in part by the ability of the nervous system to innervate, which means to control or bring life to that area. So according to this theory, any disease process can potentially benefit from chiropractic therapy. Sorry, that should say from chiropractic therapy. And I found all kinds, and you can go online and find all kinds of B.J. Palmer quotes, and some of them are pretty interesting. But here is: medicine is the study of disease and what causes man to die. Chiropractic is the study of health and what causes man to live. So I think you could probably imagine that if you were an allopathic physician, who at that time arguably didn't have that many tools, although they were getting better, right? We were moving away from the mercury and some of the really toxic medications, and we're getting close to getting some drugs on the market. But if you were an allopathic profession at that time, you might take offense at that kind of a statement. And this is just one of many, right? He really was a harsh critic of the allopathic practice. So here's another one. So what chiropractic does is that it simply takes the handcuffs off of nature, as it were, by finding the particular vertebrae that has shifted and restoring it to its natural position. The adjustment thus releases the natural flow of nerve impulse. When the maze of nerves or nature's communication system supplies the body with the energy it needs for well-being, you have health. And that's all very sensible, and I think you could argue that actually is credible, right? I don't know that I would argue, and I will say I would not agree that all disease can be cured by a chiropractic spinal manipulation. Personally, I don't feel that is true, but I definitely do believe that there is some utility in, allowing for these nerve impulses to travel unimpeded. I mean, that very definitely is very true. All right, so I think I've outlined that this was not a smooth relationship with conventional medicine and the chiropractors in general after even D.D. Palmer. They really had this sort of combative relationship. And you can see, again, here's another famous D.D. Palmer quotes. DC, which is Doctor of Chiropractic, equals disease conquered. MD equals more dope, more death. So he wasn't winning any friends. And I mean, I would argue that that's probably not the best way to go about this. So the AMA, the American Medical Association, really went after him and after this profession. They were fiercely anti-chiropractic. And actually, this didn't resolve for quite a long time. So in 1960, the AMA declared to its members that it was unethical for them to associate with the cult of chiropractic. And so it was actually against their practice, against their standard of practice to recognize or recommend any type of chiropractic treatment. So that went on for a while. And then in 1976, a chiropractor by the name of Chester Wilk and 4 other chiropractors, and I'm sorry, but I don't know their names because the suit that was filed was Wilk. He was the one that put his name on the title, versus the AMA. So Wilk versus the AMA filed an antitrust suit against the American Medical Association, and they filed that suit in 1976 by my accounts. And they fought this for quite a long time. It wasn't until somewhere around the 90s, actually, that it was resolved. So I found a couple different sources, but somewhere between like 1987 and 1990, Wilk and the other 4 chiropractors were actually victorious. And they won this, this suit, which essentially reversed this long-standing ban on the interprofessional cooperation. That's essentially what they were fighting for. They were fighting for the ability to collaborate interprofessionally between the medical doctors. And they won. And the findings of the proceedings of the suit were filed in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the American Medical Association had to pay some undisclosed sum of money, which was ultimately earmarked for chiropractic research. So that didn't solve the problem totally. It wasn't like, okay, 1990, all of a sudden the medical doctors were like, oh, yay, chiropractors, let's all send our patients there. It didn't really work out that well. And I'm sure you can, if you polled, current day, a bunch of medical doctors, some of them would be pro-chiropractic and some would be anti-chiropractic. And there's lots of reasons for that may or may not have anything to do with treatment, which we could debate about later on if we wanted to as well. But anyway, it's just sort of outlies this sort of rocky history between the medical and the chiropractic professions. So it's been less than cordial, you could say, over the years. But I think cooperation has definitely increased, mostly due to an increase in research in the area, and there's been some kind of key research that's been done that has really proved the efficacy and given the chiropractors, some scientific credibility. All right, so this is one of the things that really helped. So I believe this was 1994. So in 1994, the Agency for Healthcare Policy and Research, which has changed now to they have a different name now. I think it's the agency now. Now it's called Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. But anyway, what happened in 1994 is they developed guidelines for treatment of acute back pain. And they basically put together this panel of mostly medical doctors, and I believe it was chaired by it was an orthopedic surgeon, and I think if I remember correctly, there was like 23 people on the panel, and only two of them were chiropractors. But when it was all said and done, they endorsed spinal manipulation, and they concluded essentially that the spinal manipulation allows for people to recover faster from acute back pain. And they actually went so far as saying that they would recommend, spinal manipulation either as a replacement for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which are what are traditionally used to treat back pain in the conventional realm, or as an adjunct to the treatment with non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. But anyway, that was a kind of a landmark thing because they came out and, endorsed this treatment and said that it offered both symptomatic relief and functional improvement. So that was like a pivotal, event in chiropractic history, because by having this panel of mostly medical doctors saying, okay, yeah, this actually works, it allowed then for a lot more collaboration, I would say. All right, so I'm going to stop this video here, and we'll pick up with some of the key principles of chiropractic in the next.